T.E. Lawrence, more commonly known as Lawrence of Arabia, is one of the most legendary figures of the 20th century. Perhaps that's why there's still so many questions about the man himself. To some, he was a daring archaeologist who proved to be a great friend to the Arab people during a time of war. But to others, Lawrence would go on to become an agent of the British Empire after betraying a cause he once would have done anything to defend. During the Great War, when Lawrence and his Arabian allies captured Damascus, freeing the city from the Ottoman Empire, they were greeted like heroes. But when Lawrence found his old friend, King Faisal, in the town hall, his jubilation instantly vanished. Lawrence of Arabia was born Thomas Edward Lawrence in 1888 as the second child of Sir Thomas Chapman and Sarah Junner. It was a scandalous birth, as Junner had been the governess to Chapman's daughters until the two ran off together. Looking to escape the scrutiny of their former community, Chapman and Junner moved from Ireland to Wales and lived under the name Lawrence. The family would move around Britain several times during Lawrence's early childhood, before eventually settling in Oxford in 1896. This would prove to be a turning point for the studious young Lawrence. Despite his appetite for books, he had an even bigger one for the outdoors and adventure. In 1907, Lawrence was admitted to Jesus College in Oxford, with history as his major. Here at university, Lawrence would be known for his storytelling skills and his penchant for pranks, often climbing over walls and scaling towers around town. In the summer of 1908, Lawrence visited France for a bicycle tour. He cycled as far as the Mediterranean and visited many Roman sites as well as churches and castles. The photos and mementos he took back would form the material for an undergraduate thesis. But he would soon be struck by an even bigger idea, an archaeological trip all the way to the Middle East. He approached David Hogarth, a highly accomplished archaeologist who'd been very impressed with Lawrence's earlier finds in the local area. However, upon learning that Lawrence was planning a summer trip to the Middle East to research the Crusader castles there, he advised against it. But Lawrence wasn't swayed and insisted on carrying out his trip to the Middle East in the scorching heat of summer, and even planned to go by foot. Arriving in Beirut, Lawrence walked 20 miles a day on his journey to reach northern Syria. He was honest and outgoing and never had a problem finding food or overnight accommodations. However, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. On one occasion, a man on horseback shot at Lawrence with a rifle. Unfazed, Lawrence returned fire with his pistol, startling the rider, who then ran off. On another occasion, a man trying to steal Lawrence's watch knocked him over the head with a rock and made off with several of his belongings. Local villagers later apprehended the thief, and Lawrence eventually returned to England safely. In 1911, Lawrence returned to the Middle East with his colleague, Professor Hogarth, for a dig in northern Syria. It was during this time that he met a local Syrian teenager named Salim Ahmed, who he nicknamed Dahum. Noticing the boy's intelligence, Lawrence began tutoring him in math and English, while Dahum helped Lawrence improve his Arabic. While there is no evidence that the relationship ever became physical, Lawrence's later writings would reveal the depth of his love for the boy. Lawrence and Dahum traveled together often and were once mistaken for deserters of the Turkish army. According to Lawrence's story, they were even tossed in jail and badly beaten before being released. When he returned home, Lawrence nearly got married. He had known a woman named Janet Laurie since childhood, and they were longtime family friends. One day, Lawrence startled Janet by asking for her hand in marriage, an offer she abruptly turned down. This incident would be the only known romantic involvement that Lawrence ever had with a woman. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Lawrence didn't jump right in, only joining up a couple of months after the conflict began. Because of his language and cultural skills, he would be appointed to the intelligence office in Cairo as a lieutenant interpreter. There, he joined the effort against the Turks, who had allied with the Germans. Despite being at war, Lawrence spent 1915 doing slightly mundane office work in Cairo. His main duties were producing maps, interrogating prisoners, and making daily bulletins for commanders in the field. However, he would soon be delighted to hear that the tribes in Arabia had started a rebellion against the Turks. Always a strong believer in Arab independence, Lawrence was eager to find a way to help. Seeing an opportunity to upset the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, British intelligence knew they had to make contact with the Arab tribal chieftains leading the revolt and provide them with military aid. They needed an emissary with vast knowledge of Arabian culture and geography, and Lawrence was the perfect man for the job. Lawrence traveled to the port of Jeddah and met the British consul there. He also met with Prince Abdullah, a possible candidate to help lead the revolt. Though Lawrence was impressed by Abdullah, he was more interested in talking with Abdullah's mysterious brother, Prince Faisal, who was camped with his fighters 100 miles further inland. Lawrence readied himself for an overland Arabian trek to meet Prince Faisal. Wearing a headscarf for protection from the sun and riding a camel, Lawrence set off into the desert. After 100 miles, he finally reached the camp and was immediately impressed with Faisal Hussein, whose commanding presence earned the absolute loyalty of his men. Lawrence was certain that Faisal could lead an effective revolt against the Turks. Though wary of outsiders, Faisal appreciated Lawrence's understanding of the intricate nomadic culture of the Bedouins. When he returned to Cairo, Lawrence dazzled his superiors with his detailed account of his mission. They were pleased to hear that the Arabs wouldn't require a big European army to help them out. Lawrence insisted that all they needed were some Arabic-speaking technical advisors and a good supply of explosives. Lawrence was promoted to permanent military liaison to Prince Faisal. Although now ready to fight for Arab independence, at the back of his mind, Lawrence was also aware of the fact that the British and French had planned to divide the lands of the Ottoman Empire between themselves after the war was over. He was advised to keep the Arabs occupied in the south and out of the regions further north in Lebanon and Syria. Upon arriving back in Arabia, Lawrence became adept with explosives, quickly becoming comfortable handling all manner of cords, detonators, and dynamite sticks. He knew that the Middle East was a region centered around cities for thousands of years, and that if rail communications between the cities could be cut, the Arabs would severely weaken the Turkish forces. Prince Faisal agreed with Lawrence's strategy of widespread rail sabotage. Lawrence would first see action when he set the mines on the track leading to Medina that blew up a long section of rail and destroyed a locomotive. The strike was successful and affected Ottoman operations in the region. While conferring with Prince Faisal on the rail sabotage, Lawrence got the chance to meet Auda Abu Tayi, leader of the Hawitat tribe. This warlord had spent most of his life in tribal desert warfare and was eager to attack the Turks. Lawrence was delighted to learn that Auda believed in many of the same strategies as himself. They agreed to join forces. To carry out their plans, Lawrence and Auda had to trek through some of the most barren terrain in Arabia, meeting and joining forces with other Arab tribes along the way. Lawrence was at the limits of his endurance in the extreme conditions. On one occasion, Lawrence noticed that one of the camels was riderless. The missing man was unpopular with the group, and while most said good riddance to him, Lawrence rode his camel back for an hour and a half before finally rescuing the lost man. Although the Arabs looked at Lawrence like he was crazy, it was clear that he had gained their respect by his actions. During a skirmish in July 1917, Auda ordered a camel charge to take the city of Aqaba. But upon reaching the Turkish lines, the animal fell out from under him. It turned out that Lawrence had accidentally fired into the back of his camel's head. Despite the mishap, Aqaba had been taken. In November 1917, Lawrence was scouting the area around Daraa when he was captured by the Turks. The local chieftain, called a bey, and the prison guards tortured and abused Lawrence for several days before inexplicably letting him go. In February of 1918, in Jerusalem, Lawrence met American journalist and filmmaker Lowell Thomas. Thomas would film much of the campaign, including footage of Lawrence in action. The sight of Lawrence in his full Arab garb and headdress was a sensation in the United States, and as a result of Thomas's relentless promotion, Lawrence became an international celebrity. As Lawrence and the Arabs continued their advance into Syria, they witnessed something shocking. The retreating Turks had killed all the civilians in a Syrian town, and when Lawrence saw this, he gave the order to his men to pursue the fleeing Turkish army, destroy them, and take no prisoners. This was the only time in his career that Lawrence ever gave such a draconian order, but it was not out of keeping with the tribal blood feuds common in the region. As the opposing forces evacuated Damascus, the Arabs and Lawrence, along with the British army under General Allenby, entered the revered Arab city. As Lawrence walked the streets, welcomed by cheering crowds, he enjoyed the proudest moment of his life, but the exhilarating sense of accomplishment would be short-lived. Lawrence walked into the Damascus town hall to meet again with his old friend, King Faisal, but when he entered, something didn't feel right. Inside, Faisal and various other chieftains were engaged in heated arguments over how to organize the Middle East for the future. It was at this moment that Lawrence realized it was all in vain. It wouldn't matter what those chieftains decided, as the bigger imperial powers had already made up their mind. After the war, the Paris Treaty divided the former Ottoman territories into British and French colonies. Prince Faisal, who was now known as King Faisal, and his Arab warriors had overthrown one empire, only to have it replaced by another. Lawrence tried swaying his government to grant Arab independence, but it was to no avail. Now that the adventure was finished, Lawrence carried with him a terrible guilt, not just because of the British government's betrayal, but also his own. According to historians, it's likely that Lawrence knew the Arabs would never gain their independence as early as 2 years before the signing of the Paris Treaty. He kept quiet about this fact, giving Faisal and the others the false hope that they could be free of imperial powers. Still brooding over what he felt was a betrayal of his Arab friends, Lawrence got the news that King George V was offering him a knighthood for his service. Explaining that he could not serve both King George and King Faisal at the same time, Lawrence turned down the honor. After the war, Lawrence worked on his memoirs for years, and although it was often a haphazard writing process, in 1926 he would publish Revolt in the Desert, to instant success. His work gained favorable reviews from many of the most respected writers and critics of the time. Lawrence also found solace in one of the passions of his youth, classics. His translation of Homer's Odyssey from Greek into English was published in 1932 and is still well regarded today. In 1935, Lawrence passed away from injuries sustained in a motorcycle accident. T.E. Lawrence is one of the most studied and written about figures of the 20th century. Though he had no formal army training, he is today considered a genius of strategy. his command of complex subjects like archaeology, foreign languages, and Middle Eastern culture deepens his legacy of victory during the Great War. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything